Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the kind invitation to come and speak to you this morning. I don't know if this is the graveyard slot after the dinner the night before, but I'm very pleased to see so many smiling faces this morning. When you think of the famous names who perhaps have been the greatest influences on the way that we travel, who do you think of? Maybe Isambard Kingdom Brunel, maybe George Stephenson, maybe Henry Ford, engineers who led the way in solving some of the major challenges we faced as we experienced increasing demands on our industrially growing societies, and who built structures and machines that we still see around us today. We're so grateful for their curiosity, their determination, their experimentation. Or maybe you thought of Dr. Beeching, or Richard Branson, or Elon Musk. People who focused on the economic, the entrepreneurial perspectives of travel, who identified areas of growth and opportunity or decline and enacted policies and strategies that rapidly changed the availability of different modes within our transport system. So I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor of the Department for Transport. My job is to ensure that Department for Transport ministers and officials have the right access to data, to science, to engineering and technology expertise to inform policy of transport systems as we deliver against our goals of reducing environmental impacts of transport and improving transport for the user. And I've got a feeling that 10 years ago, someone like me wouldn't have been appointed to this role, because I'm not a civil or mechanical engineer, I'm not a mathematician, I'm not even an economist. I'm a professor of human factors and would describe myself as a human-centred systems engineer. Now, you might have heard the term human factors before, or you might not. In the UK, it's used interchangeably with the word ergonomics, which is derived from the Greek words meaning law and work. But for me, the explanation of human factors that stuck is humans are fallible and humans are brilliant. Our job is to minimise the impact of human fallibility and maximise the value of human brilliance. So today, I'm going to introduce you to some more people. Some people whose work I think is really important for us to think about more when we think about the future of transport and decarbonisation. As you've already heard, transport is undergoing a change unlike anything we have experienced in over 100 years. The introduction of increasingly automated vehicles is challenging the allocation of function between the driver and the vehicle in a way we haven't previously encountered. New fuels, from hydrogen fuel cells to sustainable aviation fuel and electric vehicles, are changing the way that we support and regulate our transport system. AI, automation and data are bringing new possibilities in the way that we can support whole user journeys, the way that we can deliver less environmentally impactful shipping or flight paths, or enable the implementation of connected and autonomous plant. But they also present challenges to privacy, security, and complexity. And we continue to face societal challenges, from the inclusion of underrepresented groups to the need to ensure that we enable economic benefit from the innovation of new technologies. So I'm going to talk about three people whose work I think can help. And you probably haven't heard of them, but for me, they are just as important as Brunel, Stephenson, Ford, Beeching, Branson, or Musk. Lisanne Bainbridge wrote my favourite ever academic paper. It has a beautifully memorable title. It's called The Ironies of Automation. Dr. Bainbridge spent much of her career in the process control industry. She spent her time watching to understand the interactions between people and the engineering systems with which they were working. And she identified ironies, unintended consequences that meant that the utopia that was perhaps envisaged by those who introduced those automated systems was not delivered. She noticed that technologies were introduced because they could do the job faster than people, but that then people were expected to monitor those technologies. She noted that the parts of the job which were automated were the bits that were easy to automate, and the resulting role was made up of the other bits, the leftover automation. So it was disjointed, and the operator was left out of the loop. Read her paper. It wouldn't get published today. It doesn't have lots of graphs or data, but it has really solid experiential insight based on embedded experience that has stood the test of time. As we undergo a transformation of our transport system, we can learn a lot from those lessons of the process control industry from the 1970s and the 1980s. The next person I want to talk about is Donald Norman. He wrote my second favourite ever academic book, called The Design of Everyday Things. Professor Norman has spent his career in technology-focused industries, and like Dr. Bainbridge, he thinks about people all the time. And he got frustrated when he saw the many, many examples of designs that simply had not considered the needs of people. Whether it was doors with handles that implied you should pull when in fact you should push, or telephone answering systems that required you to memorize random number and symbol combinations to access services. In his book, he brought to life the need to remember the human. Of the many concepts he introduced in that book, two that really resonated with me are queues and affordances. These are importantly different. Queues are explicitly introduced labels and instructions, like the lines that remind us where the edge of the train platform is, or the signs we see when we arrive at a new airport, telling us how to make our way to baggage return. Queues are a really helpful weapon in the designer's armory, but sometimes we rely too much on queues to overcome the limitations of poorly designed systems. Affordances are my favourite concept in human factors. Affordances are how we design to influence, to remove pinch points, to change behaviour. They're subtle. We're surrounded by them every day. Affordances imply interaction. They help us to decide whether to push a button or whether we can lift a seat armrest. Affordances encourage us to walk on the pavement, not the road. But they don't scream at you, do this. Affordances make your lives easier, like the easy-to-open car door, or safer, like the handrail on the stairs that's at the perfect height, so you naturally reach out and use it to steady yourselves. The image here shows an inappropriate or accidental affordance. The metal rail is designed to prevent items such as trolleys from bashing against the buildings, but the passenger's chosen to utilise the affordance of the rail as a seat. Now, you could consider affordances to be the sinister manipulation of human behaviour. I prefer to consider them as a really important part of a design of a seamless end-to-end journey, a tool to encourage change to deliver against our decarbonisation goals. When you've finished reading Lisanne Bainbridge's paper, read Donald Norman's book. The final person I want to introduce you to is my good friend and colleague, John Wilson. It's a bit cheeky to describe his book as my favourite, but it is, and I couldn't have been more honoured to share the editor role of the 4th edition with him. And I couldn't have been more sad to have to complete that task on my own after his death in 2013. John was my supervisor, my mentor, and eventually my partner in crime, where our crime was to infiltrate the world of transport and slowly, subtly, politely, carefully, with determination and maybe a friendly smile, remind transport scientists, engineers, and policymakers of how important it is to consider people when we design and deliver transport systems and policies. Amongst many ideas that John proposed was the notion of systems ergonomics. You can see here the onion model of human factors. It places people and their interactions with technology and other things around us at the centre. We don't fit people to the system. We design the system for people. The onion model recognises that people have tasks. Typically, that might be to complete a journey. But they also have goals, explaining what they want to achieve during that journey. The two aren't always the same. I wrote this talk on an aeroplane on my way to the US for an international workshop. If you measured my journey task, you might note the time it took me to complete the different legs of the journey. You might note that I was stopped at security because the machine detected an unknown sharp object in my bag that neither I nor the security operative could work out what it was. You might note there was some traffic on the M25 as we approached Heathrow. You might consider my journey was a success because I arrived at my hotel on time. But had I achieved my goals? Well, throughout my journey, I had lots of goals. I really enjoyed the taxi ride to Heathrow as I was listening to some episodes of The Archers from 2010. One of the characters died unexpectedly, and I found myself spellbound by the brilliant radio actors. The journey flew by. When I arrived in the departures lounge, my gate was called with plenty of time. Phew. Last time I was at Heathrow Terminal 5, there was a bit of a debacle with the train transit to the gates, and we all ended up running late and a bit stressed. This time I spotted an alternative, a walkway. Instead of the transit train, I decided to give it a go. I fancied doing some more steps, and I'd only done 2,000 so far that day. So I pressed a button to floor -4. Donald Norman might have had a thing or two to say about that floor numbering. And I found a bizarrely deserted walkway with moving travellators that only started going when I approached them. And I completed the theoretical 20-minute walk in 8 minutes. I arrived at my aircraft seat happy, relaxed, exercised, smug even, and with a fully charged computer ready to allow me to read my work briefing notes and then to write this talk. For me, that was the reality of my journey, and I'm not sure that just analysing a task would have picked all of that up. The other really important element of this model, the onion model, is the context. Legal and regulatory frameworks, social and cultural expectations, technological capabilities and limitations, and financial opportunities and constraints. It's so important that all of us engineers, scientists, and technologies don't just solve our own specific part of the problem in isolation, but we understand how technologies are going to be used and implemented within the whole system. Whether we need to consider the feedstocks or distribution systems that are required to enable us to change the fuels we use, or the impact on people of asking them to change their modes of travel, the system's context is key. I'll not ask you to read mine and John's books, it's over 1,000 pages. But what I'd request is that you follow its messages as we design new solutions for transport and decarbonisation. Think about people, think about systems. I mentioned the two big challenges and opportunities we face in transport, automation and decarbonisation. Both of these require change. Change in regulation, change in technology, change in behaviour, change in safety systems, and change in operations. These changes need advances in technology. They need responsibly curated data. But they also need change in choice, and perhaps it's this last one that's most difficult. In some changes, the change feels inconvenient. Using an electric vehicle over a diesel car for long journeys currently increases our journey time. Changing the fuels and systems that will enable the decarbonisation of air travel may make air travel cost more. So, as well as Lisanne Bainbridge, Donald Norman, and John Wilson, I'd like to leave you with mention of one final person. She wasn't an engineer or a scientist. She was a politician. I never had the chance to meet her, but we all, every day, experience the benefit of her courage, her insight, and in my view, her systems thinking. Barbara Castle, latterly the Baroness Castle of Blackburn, was not only responsible for oversight of the Equal Pay Act, but also during the 2.5 years that she was Minister of Transport, oversaw the introduction of permanent speed limits on British roads, breathalyser tests, and compulsory seatbelts. Those changes were underpinned by sound science and engineering. Their impacts are demonstrated by solid quantitative evidence to this day, and those changes have saved tens of thousands of lives. Apparently, the minister was told by the media, "You're only a woman and you don't drive. What do you know about it?" Maybe that difference was the key. As well as the curiosity of those pioneers of transport, as well as the tools to put people at the centre of transport, as well as the discovery of new battery technologies, delivery of new engineering solutions to distribute hydrogen safely and efficiently, and all of the other challenges we need to face, perhaps what we all need, most of all, is to have the courage and conviction to think differently. Thank you.
Fascinating finding out about your work, and I wanted to ask you, actually, because your title is quite surprising, really, whether you would just tell us a little bit about a day in your life, really.
So, I mean, the job... Oh, I don't have... Am I working now?
Yes, you are.
So, the job of the Chief Scientific Advisor is, I mean, it's an amazing job. No day is the same. So I said my job is to advise ministers, to advise policy officials, but actually it's to really understand how a government department works and think about what's needed to appropriately make sure that science is one of the many things that feeds into the decisions that are made. So it might be that I explicitly brief a minister on, for example, emergent issues around nitrous oxide emissions in aviation, or artificial intelligence opportunities, or the requirements around hydrogen fuel cells. It might be that I work with policy officials to understand the policies and the strategies that they're delivering and think about how I can make sure that I connect them up with the right academic groupings. It might be that I come and do things like this. This is a really important part of my job because we need industry, academia, and government to all work together to solve the problems that we're all facing. So I might be doing work to make sure we're articulating and communicating the priorities of the Department for Transport, such as in our areas of research interest that was published just this week, to enable that we're shaping the work that's happening externally. But it's a brilliant job, but every day is different.
It sounds absolutely fascinating. And I just hope that we could dig a little deeper, if that's okay, to find out a little bit more about how your expertise in human factors actually helps the government to deliver that more environmentally friendly transport policy.
Yeah, so it's interesting because the Chief Scientific Advisors work together across different departments. And we've all got different expertise. And actually one of the beauties of the role is it's not a permanent appointment. You're only ever in the role for a short period of time. And the purpose of that is to have a cycle of different expertise feeding into specific departments. So many of you will know Phil Blythe, my predecessor, who was a sort of transport systems engineer. Before him, we had Rod Smith, a civil engineer. Before him, Brian Collins, who again was a sort of more general systems engineer. I think there's several things about being a human factors expert that feed into my role. First of all is what I talked about just in the talk just now, which is the sort of systems thinking. Sometimes human factors can sound terribly sensible when you're in conversations like this, but actually turning it into action can be slightly less straightforward than something that is naturally much more quantitative. So thinking about how to communicate those human needs, for example, working with our data teams looking at the transport technology tracker and public attitudes towards technology, looking at what data we can collect about how people are actually using our transport systems, understanding the interaction between different regions in the UK and how they can be fed into policy is important. But also, one of the skills of a human factors professional is eliciting user needs. And so actually some of the skills I find most helpful is understanding the different perspectives that the different actors in the system are bringing to solving some of the challenges around decarbonisation. If we think about new technologies to decarbonise aviation, we've got so many important players. We've got the aviation industry who are looking to how they can sustain their activities. We've got airports who are thinking, well, we've got all these existing systems, what do we need to change? We've got regulators like the Civil Aviation Authority who are thinking about the safety and the maintenance of the systems. And so bringing together all of those different voices, understanding their different perspectives, and thinking about how we can make them work together to inform the right policy is one of the other skills that I think you have to bring.
Interesting, thank you. And also thank you very much for your questions on Slido. So let's get to some of those now. So Adam has asked, advice to ministers has to be short, and there's a convenience of BCR as a headline stat. How do we add human factors advice in a pithy way?
Yeah. So for those of you not embroiled in government, the benefit-cost ratios that we have are something that has been a topic of much discussion in government decision-making. I'd be interested in your view. There's a really, do you know what? I don't think the right solution is to try and embed absolutely everything in a BCR, because it will end up being a single figure and lots of really important things will end up being lost in the noise of the overall figure. I personally would love a version of the BCR. Remember, I don't speak for the government, by the way. I'm an advisor to the government. I would love a version of the BCR figure that almost had a number of different sliders where you could think, right, in this particular decision, I really care about levelling up. In this particular decision, I really care about inclusion. In this particular decision, I really care about delivering economic value back to UK PLC. And we could understand that if we weight our decisions differently, we come up with different answers. I will say that actually the conversations that I see in our investment boards and the conversations with ministers don't just accept the BCR figure blindly. The BCR is one of many tools that are there to inform decisions. I think one of the jobs of people like me is to make sure that we don't slip into the blind following of something which is a really helpful tool, but one of many tools that can inform our decision making.
Lord McLaughlin, I just wondered whether you wanted to add anything to that at all.
I think what Sarah has just said is absolutely right. I mean, look, there have been cases where the BCR has been ignored, and it was a good thing they were ignored. I think if you look at the Limehouse Link, for instance, the BCR was appalling on that, but without that, we would not have seen the redevelopment of Canary Wharf, which was certainly a big addition to it. Likewise, the Jubilee line. And sometimes the BCR is set over too short a period. And I think Sarah is absolutely right to say that there should be wider implications that you can look at. And certainly infrastructure projects are not something that are there for 30 years, as we've seen. Some of them last for over 100 years. And the trouble is, when you come to repair some of those projects, there wasn't quite the ISO 2000 standards that there are today around in those days, and you find all sorts of things that you weren't anticipating, but they've survived. But when you come to repair them, they don't.
Thank you, Lord McLaughlin. I wanted to go back to some of your questions, if I may. Passengers... there it is. Passengers are often... What I have to explain is they move around sometimes, so I start reading it and then it disappears. I found it again. And they've just done it again. Stop it. Stop it. So passengers are often treated as self-loading freight. How should the human experience be better considered when dealing with groups of people?
So there's a couple of things that I think are really, really important in considering the experiences of people. First of all, let's think about diversity. There's a really good piece of work that's going on within both the department, in many of our partner groups as well, thinking about what happens when you have different types of disabilities and how that affects your journeys. One really good example I've seen of this is some work we've funded through our innovation programme, which is a virtual reality system to help people with mobility limiting disabilities prepare for their journeys. We know that one of the things that causes anxiety is the perception of pinch points, so availability of the toilet on the train, confidence that someone's going to be there with a ramp, understanding of what the time implications of all the alternative routes in an underground station will be. And so tools to enable simulation for users, but also experiences for the officials who are making the policy to actually understand those experiences. And there's a really great training program going on at the moment. The second example that I would bring out, though, is the notion of deliberative research. You'll be aware of some of the work that's happening within the department looking at automated vehicles and self-driving technologies. There's a really fantastic program of deliberative research that is giving people the opportunity to travel on some of the automated shuttles that we're seeing rolled out in different parts of the UK, but a really deep measurement of their experience, looking at physiological measurements, so we're seeing their brainwaves as they're going on these journeys and spotting the moments of anxiety and excitement, but also really, really good discourse with those users. And what happens is some really excellent work in the department takes that very complex, detailed analysis and it turns it into stories, it turns it into data. There's work going on in the department to develop personas that are underpinned by really, really sound segmentation data that can then feed into decisions across the department and externally as well. So there's lots and lots of different techniques that are now being used to embed that consideration of the human experience in our decisions.
We're almost out of time. I just wanted to ask one final question, if I may. Ian Hodge, thank you for your question, which is, can we bring that one back? Is that possible? It's coming, I think. There it is, thank you. Decarbonising asset management and infrastructure delivery will rely on new, yet to exist technologies. How can government encourage investment in these new requirements?
So there's a couple of things that are being done, and I think more that can be done as well. So if we're thinking about new technologies, then first of all, we can think about demonstrator programs where the government partners with industry to actually test and trial these technologies. We're seeing this primarily at the moment in areas like low-carbon maritime transport and zero-emission road freight programs and our hydrogen hub as well. Of course, we also have policy levers. We're seeing in the area of hydrogen that the signals from government around hydrogen are extremely important in encouraging the right investment from industry to do the research that's needed in order to address those activities. But there's a final thing that the previous government chief scientific advisor was very strong on, which is the role of government as a procurer. I would love there to be stronger levers that government could be using to require a commitment to innovation in procurement that they actually are funding, but also to make sure that we've got the right framework for procurement of some of our major infrastructure programs, such as the ones that are led by the Department for Transport, to enable and encourage the use of new technologies. I talked about connected and autonomous plants. If we think about railway construction, the use of drones technologies, the use of remote monitoring to enable dynamic asset management, for example, are huge opportunities. And all too often, I see the focus on cost leading to the behaviour that some of these things that will actually deliver long-term savings get cut for short-term requirements. I haven't quite worked out how to overcome that problem, but I think there are lots of bigger brains than mine in the room that can really, really help. And I think being really clear about that role of government as a procurer, but getting the right partnership between procurement and industry to make sure that we're all working to achieve the same objective is something that's got to be key in achieving that goal.
Tremendous. Professor Sarah Sharples, thank you so much. It was absolutely fascinating hearing from you this morning. Lord McLaughlin, thank you for that wonderful welcome. Let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you.